Through these true crime podcasts, we've interviewed, in the beginning, people who'd come out of prison, then ex-police, ex-prison guards, journalists, activists, and it has formed quite a bleak worldview of the corruption and some of the rabbit holes we've gone down. Really horrifying, especially when we've talked to people about the Epstein case, what Sonia Poulton's done with Madeleine McCann and Jimmy Savile, and how, ex-cop John Wedger, he said that when he was assigned to Vice, whenever they found out about these elites taking these kids, then the investigations were closed down. So it's got more and more sinister through our own research and through our own journey on this channel, where this has taken us. Now, it has taken us to try to examine SRA, and I'd never heard of it before, expressed like that. I've seen Satanism portrayed in horror movies, and some people say this is just a thing of fantasy, so that, people can be frightened watching the TV. This doesn't happen in the real world. There's no actual cases of it. There's not people in prison right now charged with Satanism. So I discussed this with John Wedger, and he suggested that we invite Wilfred Wong on the podcast. And thank you for coming on, Wilfred. What qualifies you to talk about SRA? And could you explain what SRA is to people who are not familiar?
Well, I've been working on Satanist ritual abuse since 1993, 27 years now. And the involvement on this issue first began when, working as a parliamentary lobbyist, I was approached by one of the parliamentarians who I worked with on human rights issues, who told me that he'd been approached about SRA and would I go and interview this person on his behalf. So this person was involved in treating SRA survivors, and I met a whole group of them when I went to see him. And it all started from there. And the deeper I got involved in looking into SRA, the bigger I understood that it was and how it affects our society in a very profound way. Satanist ritual abuse is basically comprised of three components. One is sexual abuse. Second is torture, deliberate physical, emotional, psychological torture of its victims, most of whom are children, some of whom are vulnerable adults. And thirdly, which is what gives the word Satanist at the beginning of SRA, is it's done in the context of Satanist rituals. In fact, Satanists believe that this is part of their belief system, and therefore they must do these torturing of the children and sexual abuse of the children as part of their belief system. So SRA is basically usually not a one-off, but done repeatedly over a period of years. You can imagine the horrific impact this has on its victims, whether they be children, sometimes as young as infants, or vulnerable adults. So this has been going on for decades. The last time there was a very big exposure of SRA was in the 1980s in the UK. And then things died down more or less by the mid-90s. And since the exposure of Jimmy Savile, more and more interest has been revived in this subject of SRA and of cover-ups. And the interest surrounding the VIPs, child sex abuse, has also refocused people on SRA because many of these VIPs who did child abuse were doing SRA. So this has been going on for decades. Unfortunately, because of the UK authorities' lack of action, it has grown a lot bigger. And I've seen it grow a lot bigger. And I've seen the Satanists become a lot more influential than they were back in the early 90s.
So how does Jimmy Savile fit into Satanism?
Savile was not, so far as I know, a high-ranking Satanist, but he was a Satanist abuser. And although most of the media, despite all the articles on Savile, did not touch on this. At least the Sunday Express did, and they touched on it in 3 separate articles. In fact, the first article led to the second one, because after reading the first article on Saville's SRA, one of his child victims, who was now a young woman, came forward and was interviewed for the second article. And that also helped to prompt a person living in a city up north who knew about Saville coming to his city to engage in Satanist rituals, revealing his research on the subject to the Sunday Express, and that led to a third article about Saville going to this place up north in northern England to do satanic rituals on quite a regular basis. But because he was a celebrity, that makes it even more significant, even though he was not a high-ranking Satanist himself. And in a way, he's typical of many well-known people who are involved in SRA. The public, they may have some suspicions over the years, but nothing ever really comes out. The police don't really go after the person in a dogged way as they should. The fact that they are a celebrity helps to protect them. Unfortunately, there are other celebrities who have been involved in SRA and are now involved in SRA who, for legal reasons, I cannot name. And this also applies to VIPs, so-called VIPs who are in Parliament. So for years, I was well aware, since 93 when I got involved in this issue, of Edward Heath being involved in SRA. Unfortunately, he was the most senior MP at the time. He was the so-called father of the house. Nobody could touch him. I met witnesses who told me about how Edward Heath had ritually abused them. It wasn't until Operation Conifer, which happened after Heath's death, that was spearheaded by Wiltshire Police, that it began to be publicly revealed. And it's very interesting to look at the Operation Conifer report. I would encourage this because it's on the internet, on the Wiltshire Police website, and it clearly states that 6 witnesses who corroborate each other identified Edward Heath as doing satanic abuse. There you have it, official, in a Wiltshire Police report. Not surprisingly, lots of people attacked the Chief Constable of Wiltshire Police at that time, Mike Veal, for having the courage to dig deep into this issue and not simply let it go away. He was attacked, accused of everything under the sun. It was quite desperate, you could see, to silence him. But he held on, and he produced this good and revealing report of the allegations against Heath of both child sex abuse and also of satanic abuse. And he didn't mince his words on the satanic abuse. And that is part of the evidence for SRA in the UK today. I mean, we have to ask ourselves, if the Prime Minister himself could be engaged in SRA when he was Prime Minister and after, who couldn't be, who is in a position of authority in the UK?
Exactly, yeah. And we have had a Ted Heath victim on this podcast 2 times now, Mike Tarriger. So if you want to see his testimony, click down into the description box below this video on the True Crime Podcast playlist. You can watch our interview with him. So when the news headlines came out that Saville had access to corpses and mental patients, in my brain I was thinking, this is something more than just a child abuser. Does the corpse level of this, is that something that SRA participants would engage in?
Yes, it's fairly common for Satanists to be attracted to corpses, not just for sexual reasons, but also for reasons of believing that they will get power from the corpse, the energy from the corpse, especially if the corpse has not been a corpse for too long. They are always seeking to increase their power. At the heart of Satanism is the ruthless and relentless pursuit of power. And they will do anything, including having sex with a corpse, to get that power. And they will do anything, including abusing and torturing children to get that power, because they believe that all this gives them more power, and they believe that this also makes their deity, the devil, pleased with them. So there is a very sick and twisted belief system behind all this called Satanism. And obviously we should not have to agree with it, but it's helpful to know what motivates these people to do what they do. They are not just, as some people mistakenly think, pedophiles with a bit of Satanism on top. No, they are in a category of their own when it comes to extreme torture and child sex abuse and the depths that they will sink to get what they want. So it's not pedophilia. I often point out, don't use the word pedophile, because strictly speaking, a lot of these Satanists don't have a strong sexual attraction to children as pedophiles do. They see this as their religious practice to do these awful things. So this belief system also motivates them to want to radically transform society to fit their values. And this is what they've been working at for decades. And some of the changes for the worse that we see in our society today can be traced back to them. In fact, one of the first campaigners on SRA in the UK was a lady named Diane Kaur. And she wrote a book called Chasing Satan, which you can get on Amazon. And in that book, at page 13, she made a very prophetic warning. She wrote, and I quote, "But there is also a unique cultural dimension to satanic crime. The perpetrators want to change society, whereas the pedophile is interested only in satisfying his lusts and otherwise wishes the world to continue as it is. The Satanist wants to undermine the institutions and morality of society. In a democracy, they are entitled to pursue such goals, so long as they have the guts to openly declare their objectives. But they are cowards who lurk in dark corners, determined to engineer their objectives secretly." This was written in 1991.